Welcome back to the very next video, which is on the classical mainline of the Caro-Kann. This and the next video are both going to deal with the before mentioned line, and I would say they are most important as they are going to be the cornerstone of our repertoire. And not only it is a traditional and solid way by white to meet the Caro, also there is a good chance that you are going to face this line more often than the others. So let's see what are we dealing with. After the moves e4, c6, d4, d5, white can play the moves either knight c3 or knight d2. In both cases, we're just going to take on e4, and after the move knight e4, we just arrive to the starting position of our classical mainline. Now black does have some different options here. Bishop f5 being one of them, and this is the most frequent move in this position, I would say. Theoretically speaking, it is in a very good shape, but white has many dangerous options here available for him, and also white is probably the most prepared against this move because, as just mentioned before, this is black's main choice in this position. Black could play the move knight e7, which used to be a big move, though I would say it's not played that often anymore, and probably for a reason. Compared to bishop f5 and also with the move which I'm just gonna recommend in a bit, this is more passive and white can gain quite a bit of activity and white can put some pressure on black. The line which I am recommending is the move knight f6 here, with the idea of meeting knight takes f6 with the move e takes f6 and entering into the so-called Korchnoi variation. This line is very topical nowadays, and for a reason. It is tying white's hand. It does not let him to play many different sidelines as he could against, for example, bishop f5. And also it gets the position to a very unique battleground where black's chances are not worse at all. Before we delve into the lines, I would like to mention a few things about this position. But before we do that, actually, white can play in a straightforward way, forcing a weakening move from black. That is the position what we should talk about. So let's just go forward a bit and let's see how the game continues usually. White tries to put pressure on the h7 pawn with the setup bishop d3, c3, queen c2, but he can only do that by starting with the move c3 because he has to cover the d4 pawn. And after the moves bishop d6, bishop d3, castle, queen c2, now the h7 pawn is hanging. We're just gonna throw in rook e8 check, and on knight e2, for certain reasons, we're gonna play the move h5. Now we're gonna talk about why h5 is the move which is played by everyone nowadays and why that one is the best bet for black. But I think when we are talking about the characteristic of the position, probably we should talk about this one because this is the most critical due to the fact that the h5 move is not ideal. We would be more happy not to play it, but among all the possibilities, this is gonna be the best. So first of all, this pawn structure might resemble to some other openings like the exchange Ruy Lopez, and I would say the dream scenario for white would be probably to exchange down all the pieces and play a pawn endgame, which would be an outright win for him due to the fact that black cannot create a pass pawn on the king side, while white would be able to do such thing on the other side of the board. Good news, that's just never gonna happen. We're always gonna have some options to keep up some of the pieces, and even one pair of minor pieces or one pair of rooks would be enough not to lose an endgame. Now, other than the endgame consequences, in the short run, white has two different setups. Either he castles short, and actually in this video we're gonna deal with all those lines where white gonna do that, or he castles to the other side. First, it might seem very dangerous that white castles to the long side, but I would say that black has a surprisingly strong play there, and actually his pawn structure on the king side gonna prove very efficient shielding black's king. And on the other hand, black will have a surprisingly quick play against white's queen side after the moves bishop e6, immediately hitting a2 and starting to press up the pawns on the queen side. The knight might come and help the attack with some ideas with knight d7, knight b6, knight d5 or c4, depending on how the game continues. If white castles to the short side, then we are not going to go all out on the queen side. That would not be working out too well. But here we can try to utilize our pawn structure on the king side, and given the chance, playing the moves g6, f5 and transferring the knight to f6, for example, is a very efficient way to place the pieces. Now it's gonna be pretty tough to achieve because g6 many times can be answered by the move bishop g6. So probably we have to go knight d7, knight f8, to cover the g6 square and the h7 square, and with that safeguarding our king and also having some options to play g6 later on and follow it up with f5. Also, we have some ideas of playing the move h4, dropping back the bishop to c7 and play the move queen d6, and there's going to be a surprisingly strong pressure on the h2 square. We always have to keep an eye on the moves knight f4 and bishop f4, but we can even consider the move g5. Also, one other strategical point to keep in mind, that once we manage to get the knight on d5, well, it could be always chased away by the move c4. So many times what we want to do is to play the move b5 and get the knight to d5, because in that case the d5 square gonna work as an outpost almost, because c4 will be answered by b takes c4. Hence white will have a very hard time getting rid of that knight. And lastly, exchanging some minor pieces is something not to be feared, though we definitely want to keep up at least one pair to have more dynamic options. All in all, I would say as long as we are playing a middle game, we are pretty good to go. And the only thing what we have to keep in mind that we don't want to enter into a pawn endgame. But once again, that's not something what white can force us to do. With all that, let's check out all the lines with short castle, but also the options for white, what there might be before we are getting to this position. So let's just go back to the very beginning. And here, after the move knight f6, actually, there are already some choices for white available, though if white does not take on f6, black should not complain at all. Black will have a very easy play. One of white's options is to play the move knight g3 here, which I believe probably might happen if white mixes up his own theory, because if we were to play the move bishop f5 instead of the move knight f6, one move before, here the very main move is knight g3. So after knight f6, white might think that knight g3 is something smart to do, but here it turns out that after the move c5, black already equalized. Actually, there is another way, and that is to play the move h5 first with the threat of h4, forcing white to play h4, probably that's the best move for white here, and we could play c5 here. So with the pair of moves h5, h4 included, just go for the same plan. This is perfectly playable as well. Probably the simplest is just to go c5 right away, but once again, both of those moves are perfectly playable. D takes c5 is never a move that we are afraid of. We can always exchange the queens, and with that, forcing the white queen to be misplaced on d1, and just follow up with some logical moves like e6 hitting the c5 pawn, and on b4 playing a5, now b4 is hanging, on c3 playing the move knight d5, now c3 is under attack, and also b4 is hanging, so bishop d2 is forced. Follow it up with a takes b4, c takes b4, and knight c6, once again coming with force. Now b4 is hanging. b5 is not a good idea for white because we do have knight d4, and after that black is just so active, c5 is hanging, white would be in trouble. But it turns out that there is no other way to really cover that b4 pawn. a3 is not an option because b4 would be still hanging due to the pin on the a3 pawn, and on rook b1 we can simply take on a2. Follow it up with bishop e7, castle. There are some ideas with rook a3, knight c3 check, and black is perfectly fine, and white has some problems with his king on d1. Let's just go back because the move d takes c5, once again, it's never a move what we are really afraid of. Here probably white is better off to play some moves like knight f3, but here we can just play the move knight c6, and on bishop e3, take on d4, throwing queen a5 check, and on c3, exchange few more pieces, and e5 comes in time. Next up is bishop e7 and castle, and black has a very comfortable position thanks to his nice central pawn on e5. So if we go back, white could try the move bishop b5 check here, but after the move knight c6 we would be fine. We don't have to be afraid of bishop c6, b takes c6, due to the fact that there is a tension in the center in between the d4 and c5 pawns, so we are not going to be left with a double isolated pawn. But also we could play the more simple bishop d7, exchanging few pieces, and with that covering the c5 pawn as well. Follow it up with e6, bishop e7 and castle, achieving complete equality. If we just go back, knight g3 is just not a dangerous move here, but we do have to remember that c5 is the most precise reply there. White could try the move knight g5 with some ideas connected to bishop c4, but actually this is not dangerous at all. and we can play c5 once again. And on bishop c4, we've just covered the f7 square with e6, and after the moves knight e2, knight c6, knight f3, we can play a6 with the idea of going b5, bishop b7, and if white stops us from that with the move a4, we can play b6, follow it up with bishop b7, achieve a very nice position. Now there is one more move which I wanted to mention, and that is the weird looking queen d3, but it's not as bad as it might look. Now the only thing which we really have to be aware after the move queen d3 is that we don't want to play bishop f5, because that would lose a piece after the move knight f6 check, queen takes f5. So here we have the move queen d5, and white might want to kick out our queen on d5 with the move knight c3, and here we can continue with queen a5. Now if we look at this position, surprisingly, this is something which could have arisen from the Scandinavian defense, which I am not a fan of, because there black is just playing around with his queen, losing too many tempes for no real reason. But here we are getting a version of it which is quite good for black. The reason is, it is true that this is a Scandinavian defense per se, but white played the move queen d3. Now it's not only wasting a tempi, but rather it's wasting two tempes, because once we play bishop f5, the queen has to move once again. So for example, after the move bishop d2, we are free to play bishop f5, and on queen g3, we can play the move e6. We just gained quite a few tempes compared to the traditional Scandinavian, and with that, here black has no problem. Now let's just go back, and after the move knight f6, white's best move is to take the knight on f6. Now here we're gonna play the move e takes f6, and that is the Korchnoi variation, though probably I should mention that g takes f6 is a possibility as well. There were some games to it, though I'm not going to recommend it, because I have the feeling if white plays some fairly standard moves, he's gonna end up in a superior position and it's gonna be an uphill battle for black. Hence I would really go with the move e takes f6, which is strategically speaking much more sound. And I mentioned at the beginning that here white's main idea and the most critical try is to play the moves c3, bishop d3, queen c2, and with that force us to make a decision on the king side, and our best bet gonna be the move h5, which I'm gonna explain in a bit. But here white could try some other things. But once again, it's important to keep in mind that in the main line, white could get some positions where he could force us to play h5. So many times you might just hear me saying that, well, compare it to the main line, and we're gonna look at those positions and compare that. It's gonna be even better for us if white does not force us to play the move h5. So for example, if white plays the move bishop c4, which is gonna develop with bishop d6, and here white could play the move knight e2. Now we would just castle. After the move castle, we can play the move rook e8. Now on bishop f4, we can play bishop g4, and we can exchange one pair of pieces, and on c3 just continue the development with knight d7, and on queen c2, play g6. The idea setup to remember is bishop e6, f5, knight f6. Now let's just go back. Actually, white can throw in a check with queen e2 in this position, and it's kind of annoying. We could play the move queen e7, but to my taste that would lead to a kind of a boring endgame. It's perfectly possible, and I believe it's equal, but still in an endgame we would have a harder time to generate enough play to have good winning chances. Hence I'm gonna suggest the weird looking bishop e7. Now if you remember, we just played bishop d6 on the previous move, so it might be a question, why didn't we play bishop e7 right away? But I would argue that the queen on e2 is actually not better than it was on d1. For one, it does not let the knight to develop to e2. Also the d4 pawn is hanging right away. And other than that, the queen on e2 doesn't really achieve anything. So the game might continue with the moves knight f3, castle, castle, bishop d6. So we are getting back to our original setup. And after c3, here we could continue with fairly standard rook e8 and follow it up with knight d7, knight f8, sooner or later g6, f5, bishop e6. But also I wanted to mention another plan which we're gonna see in some other positions as well, but it's gonna be quite strong against the bishop on c4, and that is to play the move knight a6 with the idea of transferring the knight to d5. Now the reason why it's stronger here with the bishop on c4 than it would be, for example, if the bishop was on d3, is that once our knight arrives to d5, the move c4 is not going to be an option for white because the bishop is just stopping that pawn. Also, you might ask what happens if bishop a6, but it turns out that after b takes a6, with the pair of bishop and with the play on the light squares, and also due to the fact that white cannot really attack those guys, black is doing fine. If white does not take on a6, he could play the move queen c2, and that happened in one high-profile game in between Karyakin and Navarra, and I think the game continued in a very nice way, which is a very good illustration of how black should position his pieces. So let's just take a look at this game. Black played the move rook e8, knight d2, knight c7, bishop d3, now h7 is hanging, so g6, knight e4. We don't want to give up our bishop for the knight, so bishop f8, bishop d2, f5, kicking out the knight from e4, knight g3, knight d5, rook fe1, bishop e6, knight f1. That was a game that I mentioned before in between Karyakin and Navarra. And here black could have continued with the move queen c7, having some ideas connected to knight f4, and also some ideas connected to the move b5, which is something which I also mentioned already, that if we manage to play the move b5, the d5 knight actually becomes a very strong piece. White will never be able to kick it out with the move c4. Here c4 could be answered by knight b4 or knight f4, so it was not yet on the agenda for white, but after the move of b5, it's not even gonna be possible. And once again, the way how black positioned all his pieces is just ideal, and that's something what we are striving for, and we do have a very nice position here. Let's just go back to the beginning and let's check out what happens if white plays the most critical line, and that is to force us to make a decision on the king side. So if we are going back to the very beginning, white wants to put pressure on the h7 pawn, as mentioned already, and he can achieve that by playing bishop d3, c3, queen c2, but he has to play it in this precise move order, starting with c3. Now we go bishop d6, bishop d3, castle, queen c2, and rook e8 check, knight e2. And here black has to make a decision. I already told that we're gonna play the move h5, but I'm guessing it might have been very surprising. But let's see, why do we choose that move? Let's see what other options do we have. We could play the move g6, and that would be very natural. And let's say if white castled to the short side, it would be just perfect, because we could play the move f5, knight d7, knight f6, bishop e6, and we would achieve a very nice position. The problem being that here white would switch plans, and he would go for the immediate h4, already have some h5 ideas. We cannot really play h5 ourselves because the g6 pawn is just so weak, and maybe black can survive in one way or another, but I would say that it's gonna be a one-sided battle. We could play the move h6, which might look more logical than the move h5, but actually it has two drawbacks. One is whenever white castles and wants to follow up with knight g3 and knight f5, we're gonna have a hard time dealing with that, as opposed to have the pawn on h5, when we could just push it up to h4 and with that restrict the knight on e2. And also many times the pawn on h6 can be even weaker than it would be on h5, due to the fact that we have to be on the lookout for some sacrifices with bishop h6. So because of that, the move h6 would not be any improvement over h5. We could also try the move king h8, because here bishop h7 is not working right away. We could just trap the bishop with g6 and complications would work out for us. We would not get checkmated, and white would be in a little bit of a trouble due to the lack of development. But the problem being that with king h8 we are not really solving the problem of the h7 pawn forever. We are rather just postponing the problems. So sooner or later we still have to do something on the king side, and that gonna be either g6, which can run into h4, h5, or we can play h6 later on, but in that case, once again, we might be hit by some ideas with bishop h6, or we could play h5 later on, but in that case, why to waste time with king h8? Just one last thing to mention here. Interestingly enough, one of the engine's choices is the move f5, which is a move which looks kind of funny because it can be taken, and after takes, queen takes f5, knight d7, well, black does not get anything concretely, but black has some certain counterplay, and actually it was played by some strong players, though I believe only in blitz or rapid games. I would never go for this because even though I do feel that black does have some counterplay, it feels like an easy game for white, where if he manages to get his pieces out and finish up development, then basically he's gonna be up a pawn. So let's just go back, and all in all, our best chance is to play the move h5, but once again, it's not gonna be as bad as it might seem at first, and white does have two ideas here. he can castle long. We're gonna deal with that in a separate video. Or white can play the position with short castle, which we're gonna take a look at now. Here, we should choose the move h4, which has multiple ideas. Not only restricts the knights from jumping to g3, but also hinting the move h3, which might be annoying for white. No wonder that most players are opting for the move h3 themselves here. Though white has some other options, and I think it's important to take a look at those because, contrary to what we might think, we might not go h3 right away even if we get the chance. For example, after the move rook e1, if we were to play the move h3, turns out that white can create a pretty quick attack against our king with the moves bishop f4. And if we take on g2, he can take on d6, play the move knight g3, and having some ideas already with knight f5 and knight h5, and we also have some problems on the back rank. So bishop e6 seems logical, and after the move rook e4, white not only is ready to double up on the e file, but also he might have some ideas with rook h4, and there might be some certain problems along the h file. So that's not the direction where we want to go. h3 is an idea for us, and we're gonna play it sooner or later if white does not take care of it, but we should not play it right away. Here I think the best way is to play just with our original and logical setup and play the move knight d7 and follow it up with knight f8. So for example on bishop f4 we are in time to play the move knight f8, protecting the bishop on d6 and also getting our knight to a good square. And here there was one game with the move queen d2, and I think this would have been the time to play the move h3. And after the move bishop d6, queen d6, now white has to be a little bit careful. Turns out that the move g3 would already be a mistake, and after bishop g4, white cannot really position his pieces in a way he wants to, and he's gonna have some problems with the square on g2. For example, after the move knight f4, probably g5 is very strong, and the knight does not have any other squares but to go back to e2, and on queen d5, it's already impossible to cover the g2 square. So if we just go back, white is better advised to play the move knight f4 here, but here we can take on e1 and take on g2, and on rook e8, after the move rook b8, we will be able to finish up our development and solve the problem of the back rank, and with that achieve an equal position. There is one more thing to mention, and that is what happens if white, instead of the move rook e1, plays the move bishop f4, and that is here. And the reason why we have to talk about it, because first it might seem it's a blunder. Black can win material with rook takes e2, queen takes e2, bishop takes f4, but that's a famous trick which we should not fall for, because here white could go queen e4 and not only threatening to take our bishop but also threatening to play queen h7, rook e1, queen h8 and checkmate us, and turns out that white is winning. So we have to do something else. We cannot play knight d7, obviously, because the d6 bishop is hanging. Hence, now we're gonna go in a different direction, and that is to get the knight out to a6. We already seen some similar situations. We are not afraid of bishop takes a6, because after b takes a6, even though we are not going to have the pair of bishop after the moves bishop d6, queen d6, we do have a strong initiative. First of all, we are kind of threatening to play h3 due to the fact that white is missing his light square bishop, and if we manage to weaken up the light squares, white might be in trouble. And if white plays the move h3, we can follow it up with a very active move c5, and it's very easy to imagine that bishop b7 is coming, queen d5 or c6 potentially coming, and black rooks are very active, and with all those activity, that's gonna give us enough compensation in exchange for the crippled pawn structure. So usually white does not take on a6, but rather plays something else. So for example, rook ae1 is one possibility, and here we can continue with knight c7, that's the idea behind knight a6, and on queen d2, bishop e6 is very logical, a2 is potentially hanging, so b3, and here probably the best way to continue with black is to play the move h3, and on g3 play the move a5, playing on both sides and trying to create some weaknesses in white's camp. And after bishop d6, queen d6, knight f4, we're just gonna keep our bishop alive and dropping it back to d7, and next we might go b5 and knight d5. We're gonna have quite a nice play on both sides of the board. The g2 square is weak, and also we do have some ideas on the queen side as well. And with all that, black solved all of his problems. I think it's better for white not to let us to play h3 and play h3 himself, because as we can see, for example, in this position as well, he might end up with a very weak g2 square. So let's just go back. If white plays the move h3, in that case, we can continue with knight d7, or very typical plan, and transfer the knight back to f8. Once again, there are some different options. For example, on bishop f4, we are in time to play knight f8, and bishop d6, queen d6 might be one direction, but this is pretty similar to those scenarios that we have already seen. Next, we could play g6, f5, and maybe even get back the knight f6 via h7 or via d7, or just get out the bishop to e6. We do have an easy play. White can play some different moves besides bishop f4, so let's check them out. So if white plays bishop d2 here, as usual, we're gonna continue with knight f8, and on rook ae1 we can play bishop c7, which opens up some possibilities in connection with queen d6, queen h2, and on king h1, amongst other things, black can play the move b5, for example, with the idea of bishop e6 and strengthening the pressure on the g8, a2 diagonal, or we could play the more traditional g6 with some ideas like f5 or bishop e6 or knight e6 for that matter, and having a comfortable position. The main idea for white, instead of the move bishop d2, is to play the move c4, which is a bit more active approach. So here c4, but once again, we are in time and we're just going to continue with our usual plan to play knight f8, and on bishop e3 we can play the move bishop e6. Now, just as a side note, there is this interesting idea of playing g5, king g7, knight g6, and with that trying to take over the control of the f4 square, and after that bishop c7, queen d6 might gain some strength. I think it is interesting, though probably it's weakening up our king side a bit too much, and white might gain some advantage eventually, as I would rather go for the more traditional bishop e6. Not only it's a bit more safe, but also just to illustrate how dangerous the position is, if white plays the natural looking a3, then already after the move queen d7, turns out that there is no way to deal with the threat of bishop takes h3. For example, after the moves rook a d1, we can take on h3, g takes h3, queen takes h3, and black is already just winning. There is no way to save white's king. And the problem for white is that after the move knight f4, which would cover the h3 square, we can just take on f4 and pick up the pawn on d4. And even though white does have some counterplay for the sacrificed or blundered pawn, but still I would say black is doing very well, because after all, we are up a pawn and we do not have any weaknesses whatsoever. So white shouldn't play the move a3, and white has to be careful. So probably the move rook a d1 is better suited for him. Now, one of the ideas is that if we go queen d7 once again, on knight f4 is very possible, and after bishop f4, the d4 pawn is not hanging anymore due to that little tactical trick, bishop h7 check. So we should play something else. One idea to keep in mind that in such positions we can even think about knight g6. Now, bishop g6, fg, queen g6 is not something to be afraid of because c4 pawn is hanging. The white could play the move d5 himself, and after c takes d5, c takes d5. Now bishop d5 is not good due to bishop g6, and if we retreat to d7 with the bishop, now white could potentially take on g6. But still, in these kind of positions, black always can have some counterplay, and it's just worth keeping in mind that knight g6 might be an idea even if we are giving up a pawn, but I'm not going to suggest that because probably white is the one who is pressing. So instead of the move knight g6, we should try something else, and probably rook c8 is a move which is also worth remembering. Not only the rook might be handy on the c5, because if white plays the move d5, for example, then after the exchanges on d5 the rook cannot be perfectly placed on the c5, but also we have some ideas with dropping back the bishop to b8, and after that we want to keep the connection in between the rooks, and once the bishop gets to b8 we do have queen c7 and queen d6 available for us later on. So let's say white plays the move queen a4, and here we can already play knight g6. Now this is a pawn sacrifice. White could take on a7, but if he does that right away, after queen d7, turns out that rook a8 is a threat, trying to get back our pawn on a2 or trap the queen, and also bishop h3 once again is a very strong idea, and white is in trouble. So if white wants to take on a7, he has to include the move d5. c takes d5, c takes d5, bishop d7, and now he can take on a7, but this pawn sacrifice is much stronger than the previous ones, and black definitely has enough compensation. Knight e5 is a strong move. Now the bishop on d3 is targeted, we want to pick it up and get a pair of bishops, and it turns out that the bishop cannot really retreat, because in that case we would have the move knight c4 available for us, targeting the e3 bishop and the b2 pawn, and we would just have such a strong play that white would be in trouble. So let's say white plays the move knight c3, gives up his bishop on d3, we take it, and after the move b5 we do have a tremendous compensation for the pawn. One thing to mention, queen d4 could be answered by the very strong rook c4, so that's not an option for white. We do have a strong play on the light squares. We do have some tactical ideas against the white's king thanks to the pair of bishop which is directed against it. We do have some ideas against the white's queen, which is also a little bit exposed on a7, and white's pawn structure is not ideal either. The d5 pawn might be weak, and also the queenside pawns are not that safe either. And with all that and with all the active pieces, black has a nice compensation. Also, this main line illustrates very well how black should place his pieces. So even if white plays in a different way, this placement of the pieces and these ideas should lead to a very playable position in most of the cases. With all that, there is one more thing to cover, and that is what happens if white plays the Korchnoi variation with long castle, and that's gonna be seen in the very next video.